Start a Therapy Practice podcast, episode number 42. Hey there, how you doing? This is Scott Harmon from startatherapypractice.com, empowering you to start and run a therapy practice, to market that practice, and then to take your business skills to the next level. So glad you joined me today. Hey, we got a great interview today with Jeff Stepen. He's a speech therapist, and what's super cool is that he also has a podcast. Now, I will admit that I have a little bit of microphone envy in this conversation with Jeff because he has a really nice microphone. But I'm getting counseling for that, so don't worry, don't panic. I am making progress in my microphone envy. But I had a great time with Jeff. He's a great guy, and he's got an app that he developed, and he's going to talk about that app. You can check that app out at thesocialbunch.co, and I'll put a link in the show notes also. But what's also super cool is that Jeff has a private practice. He works in the schools, but he also on the side has his own private practice. So we're going to talk about his private practice and some tools that he uses. I always like to talk about the nuts and bolts. Tell me what you use. So we're going to talk about how he runs and operates his private practice. Now, Jeff's podcast is specifically for speech therapists, but I know your OTs and PTs would get something out of it also. Jeff focuses on autism and assistive communication devices. He also talks app development over there, and he's big into the technology space of speech therapy and therapy in general. And he has some great interviews with other speech therapists and other therapists over there also. His podcast is called Conversations in Speech. He's got a website for that over at conversationsinspeech.com. And you can also find his podcast over on iTunes or in Stitcher. So be sure to subscribe to Conversations in Speech. As I mentioned, Jeff has recently developed an app. It's geared towards clients who have autism. And we're going to unpack that towards the end of the show. Now, I highly recommend that you check out his app if you work with any clients who have autism, who are on the spectrum, who have difficulties following verbal directions and visual directions. As I mentioned, that app can be found at thesocialbunch.co. Now, Jeff says he wants to give away 5 copies of this app. And so all you have to do is email him, and I'll put a link in the show notes, but all you have to do is email him, and his email is Jeff, Jeff, at conversationsinspeech.com. So email him, and then let him know in that email that you listened to him on my podcast, Start a Therapy Practice, and you'd like to register to win the free app called The Social Bunch. Now, from all the emails that he gets, he's going to select 5 names, draw them out of a hat, and 5 people will win his app for free. Super good deal. But I mentioned in the show that I think a stipulation for that is that you have to rate that app in the iTunes store. I think that's a fair trade. If you're just thinking about starting a private practice, or you just got started, or heck, even if you've been doing private practice for a little while, I just want to let you know that I have an ebook that covers A to Z how to start and run a therapy practice. And you can check out that ebook over at startatherapypractice.com/ebook. Now, you know we're going to mention some web links in this episode today, so be sure to go over to startatherapypractice.com/42, and you can see all of the links that we mentioned in this interview. And with that, let's go listen to the interview. Here we go. Jeff, I appreciate you joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Scott. Thanks for having me on. It's an honor. Big fan of the podcast.
Oh, well, the same goes here for you. I was listening to your podcast earlier today. And Jeff, explain what topics that you cover in your podcast.
You know, when I started the podcast, it was really meant to be a very general speech pathology podcast. So I didn't want it to be bogged down in any one area. But that being said, I have my interests and areas that I tend to practice more so than others. So really, if you look at everything, it tends to be a little bit more geared towards autism, a little bit more towards, let's see, I'm trying to think, AAC, of course, augmentative communication, which I'm really big into. And probably about half of the episodes right now are AAC specific. But most recently, I've released now 2 episodes as of today that have to do with dysphagia, something that I don't even encounter anymore or deal with. So my kind of hope right now, and I think I've said this in the first episode that it might change, but I really want to cover just any aspect of speech pathology, because really what I'm looking for is not just clinical information. I'm looking for that, but I'm also looking for interesting stories and interesting perspectives. So yeah, it's a little bit of everything.
Cool. We'll come back to the podcast because, of course, I'm interested in that. But I want you to give people a background as far as where you're working at now as a speech therapist. I know you have a private practice, so kind of unpack that for us, where you're working and how your private practice has developed, when you started it and what it has developed into now.
Sure. So my private, I'm going to go back and forth, I guess. But, I graduated with a master's in 98 and I worked with adults. My first job was in an acute care hospital. And I did that. That was my CFY year, clinical fellowship year. I did that for a year, came back to Chicago and just worked some contract jobs working mostly again with adults, aphasia, mostly swallowing dysphagia. And kind of getting burned out in the whole thing. And I was exploring other options. And one of those options was working with kids. And so long story short, I started making a transition. I was working for a contract agency and she had contacts all over. So she started giving me assignments in private clinics and hospital-based clinics. And so I started doing that. And in 2001, I made the leap to private practice full-time. I worked in early intervention. I did most of my work back in the early days where I was a traveling therapist, did not have my own space. So I used my, at the time, 2001, I was still living in my parents' house, saving up money, paying back loans. And then in 2003, I moved into my own place. And so I basically do all my billing, all the paperwork in my home, and sometimes at a Starbucks with my laptop on the road. And it wasn't until, so I got married in 2003. It wasn't until 2007 that I began to get a physical space. In 2007, I got my own physical space. And so I was still doing some home-based visits, but more and more people were coming to see me. And so what happened from there is that 2010, I'm going to kind of skip forward here. 2010, I went back, or I should say went back. I took a job in the public school system here, and I've been in the public schools for the last 5 years now. And that's where my interest in augmentative communications come from. So I work with kids with moderate to severe disabilities in a low incidence program. And I still keep my private practice. So I still see a handful of clients, and I share an office now with a couple of psychologists in a smaller space, in the same building that I've been in for the last 7 years. I should mention this, everybody's private practice is different and everyone's circumstances are different. And I don't think I talked about this in my first podcast episode, but the reason why I actually left full-time private practice myself had to do with healthcare costs. My wife, she's been a stay-at-home mom, and unfortunately, around 2009, 2010, we had some health issues. And it was really, what happened was, going back after I got married and having kids, our health insurance premiums kept going up, skyrocketing, going up 20% easily every year. Saw the writing on the wall. I said, there's no way 5 years I won't have a practice if I don't do something. And so I never wanted to give up the private practice wholesale. So what I did was the best compromise I could by taking a full-time job and getting benefits, and then also continuing to work private practice now. So that's what I've been doing for the last 5 years. Busy man with that and the podcast, but it's been okay.
That is really good. I can appreciate the rising healthcare costs. Yes, I have to pay for my healthcare out of pocket, and it doesn't get any cheaper. So I can appreciate that. Tell us about how you got interested in private practice. You're like, you know what? I think I'd be interested in having my own private practice. Unpack that a little bit for us.
I think it was a couple of things. I mean, I've always been a kind of an entrepreneurial spirit myself. I know since I was a kid, I'd always had ideas of opening businesses. My friends and I, it's one of those things where I just never took the leap. And I think a couple of things kind of happened together. One was that, unfortunately, I'd had a couple of really bad experiences employer-wise after graduating. I think the two kind of coalesced, because there was a time where I was actually thinking of leaving the field altogether. And I was just going to walk away from speech pathology and take a job. But
was that because of the bad experiences from your employers?
It was a couple of things. I think it was a couple of it was employers. One of it was that I was just getting burned out working with adults. And so I had such a bad taste in my mouth from the first couple of years. I'm making it sound worse. It's not that I didn't enjoy my job or the patients. I did. I definitely had my good days, but I think it was just this gnawing feeling that if I was going to continue to do this, I had to do it on my own terms. And once I did, my happiness shot up like 100%. And the other headaches that came along with it, the billing, insurance, and all the other problems that come along with a private practice. We all have problems in life, but those were secondhand. I mean, I didn't take that home with me. I was a much happier individual. And I loved the kids and I loved the autonomy.
Take us back to right when you started there. How did you drum up business, and how did you think about drumming up business?
I have to say, a lot of people, I don't know if this has happened in other states, but the early intervention program in Illinois, there was a time when that was a good place to start a practice. And, what I mean by that is in the mid 90s, it was still a fairly new program, and they were still paying a fairly decent wage for PTOT speech. So when by 2001, when I started that practice, it was really just maintaining and building relationships with service coordinators. They're sort of like the social workers who, I don't know if they have a different name for them in other states, but the folks who, these nonprofit agencies who sort of work with the state and helping pair therapists with kids in need. And so I just started getting a lot of referrals because there was just that much business. I think I could have had 5 people in my area open a practice within a year, and I still would have had enough business. Now it's gotten a little more competitive, I think, over the years. But back then, I think it was a good place to start. And what happened was that, not just with me, but with other therapists, is that the kids aged out of early intervention. The parents wanted to stay with you because they wanted to stay with the person they knew and they trusted. What happened was that those families in turn recommended me to their friends and colleagues, and that's how I built my practice. Yeah.
Are you still seeing early intervention clients?
No, I stopped in, let's see, probably right when I started the school. The reason is, and I don't want to pick on the state of Illinois too much, but we have probably the most god-awful run state in the country right now. Our pension systems are a mess. Our funding for social services are a mess. It's a god-awful. And what's happened with early intervention, unfortunately, is that the rate of reimbursement has just not kept pace with inflation. And so if you look at the reimbursement today versus what it was, say, like 1997, the needle's barely moved. And so whereas in 2001, it was doable, today, I look at it and I think to myself, I can see some people on the side doing this as an aside thing. But as far as running a full-time private practice, having the majority of your clients in early intervention, I just don't see how it's possible, especially when you have a physical space and payroll, and I don't see it.
Yeah, the margins are pretty small. I'm specifically curious about early intervention because I had to fire early intervention about 4 years ago here in our state. And since it is a federal program, if people don't know, it's a federal program that's obviously federally funded. So they get to dictate the terms for the most part of how that rolls out. Now the state has to implement it, but I mean, anything that gets centrally managed like that has so much bureaucracy and paperwork that frustrated me. And like you said, the margins on income are so small that it just didn't, the juice is not worth the squeeze. So I had to fire them. Is that what you found out?
Yeah. And eventually, I remember receiving the paperwork for extending my credential, and, it wasn't even, I suppose it was partly the pay. It was also partly all the hoops that you had to jump through just to be credentialed and to maintain your certification with early intervention, and the billing process. Everything was just so, it's funny because I remember one of the podcast episodes I did, I think it was, for me, episode 9, Jessica Aubin. I remember asking her, because she does Medicare billing, and she sees adults. And I remember asking her how hard it is. And she said, it's actually not that hard. I mean, there's definitely a steep learning curve, but once you get set up, it's actually pretty easy. But at least here in the state of Illinois, they've never streamlined the process. I shouldn't say that because I haven't billed in 5 years. Maybe they've updated it, but
probably not.
I just remember it was just this real hassle because there was a time in Illinois where you didn't have to bill the family's insurance. what you did was you just bill directly to the state. And so now there's this convoluted system where you first have to bill the family's insurance, wait to receive payment from them, and then balance bill the state. And of course, it's capped at so much, and it could really become a mess. And now, payments are delayed, I think, like 3 to 6 months at least. So you've got providers who are basically waiting 6 months from the time they saw the kid to the time that they get paid. And if you've been working for a year or so, I mean, you've got a cycle going there. But yeah,
how does anybody do that?
I would love to take a poll in Illinois, but I'm just sort of guessing that most of the people doing, or at least a good chunk of the people doing speech therapy, are part-timers doing it in addition to something else. Maybe they're doing it as a second job. Maybe they're working in a clinic full-time, or they're doing this on the side. But again, like I said, I don't know. I just can't see how the numbers can work out in your favor if you're relying on this as your sole income, as if you're maintaining any type of physical space. I mean, everyone's situation is different. I mean, if you're just bringing a second income and you have a spouse who's a primary breadwinner and anything you make is just gravy, well, I mean, then obviously it makes sense and you want to do it because you love being a speech pathologist. So like I said, everyone's situation is different, but as a full-time business, don't see it.
Yeah. What are you billing mostly right now?
It's funny because I don't know. I don't keep track with insurance markets, at least in the Chicago area, but I have to say that it seems like the majority of my clients over the last 5 years have been Blue Cross. So I have a couple that I bill. I have one former military family, TRICARE. So we're working with TRICARE, and one family I've been working with forever. And then one right now, Cigna, I think, but it's mostly Blue Cross. And Blue Cross they're pretty easy to deal with for the most part.
Yeah, we have a number of Blue Cross clients here. I always like to get in the weeds here because it is about private practice. What type of progress notes and billing are you using?
You know what? I discovered something recently. So I probably did something that I was pretty anachronistic. I was using just handwritten notes for a while, and then I finally moved into the digital and the cloud realm. Okay, so most recently I was putting everything into Dropbox, which is not a really good thing FYI to all your listeners, not a great idea as far as HIPAA privacy is concerned, right? You don't want out there. But I just recently discovered this plugin or service. It's called Sukasa. Have you heard of this?
I use it.
Do you? Okay, yeah. So I just signed up for this. And for those of you who don't know, Sukasa is basically, they're a company out of San Francisco, I believe. And they basically encrypt any portion of your Dropbox files that you want to. So now what I do is I have all my patient files in Dropbox folders. And I just basically type them on Microsoft Word on a template that I have. That's what I've been doing now for a little while. So that's what I use for documentation. As far as billing, we have a very, you'd probably laugh. I have a software program. We have an older PC at home that we're using. This program called Easy Claim. They're a pretty big company, I think. You probably heard of them. But the software version that I'm using is probably, I want to say 2006, 2007. And I was just joking to my wife. My wife does my billing, by the way. I taught her shortly after we got married. She handled all of it because I couldn't, I don't have the patience for it. And so she knows if I had to go back to billing tomorrow, I'd have to relearn everything because I don't even know. It wouldn't be that hard, but I forgot most of it. So now the big worry right now is I'm using this 2006 or 2007 version of Easy Claim on the desktop. And that's just to generate the claim. And then I have a service called eClaims online, and they're the actual clearinghouse that send my claims over. So I use those as kind of like 1-2 punch here. But the thing with Easy Claim that I'm worried about is I don't know if it'll accept the new ICD-10 codes. So I have to kind of wait. I just sort of entered a couple of sample codes just to see if it would take it. But I won't know until October whether or not it'll work. So I'm going to keep my fingers crossed, because the reason why we haven't upgraded Easy Claim is the newer versions were much more sophisticated than what I needed. And I haven't looked in a couple of years, but the prices were just much higher than what I wanted to pay. And if I'm only seeing a handful of clients a week, I just don't, I don't need that kind of Cadillac service.
There's probably a market for people like you and I in private practice. We're only using a handful of codes. We don't need every code that's in the CPT book and the ICD-10 book. So I can appreciate that.
Exactly. As a matter of fact, I thought of it. I have a good business idea. Here's something that I thought of recently. So there's companies out there, and someone will probably offer this now that I say it, but it's something that I wish was there. I won't name the companies, but there are a handful of companies that specialize in therapist practices. Okay, I'm not going to name them, and that I've heard that they all do just a really good job. I have a friend who runs a larger private practice in the area. She won't use any cloud-based service like that because she's always worried about the day that she decides to leave their service and what happens to all of her data. So she won't do that. But I'm a risk taker. As long as they're compliant with HIPAA laws, I'm fine with it. But the problem with these companies is that, and I remember going to at ASHA at the convention and talking to them and almost pleading with them because there's always that minimum dollar amount that they're going to charge you a month to process your claims, whether you have one client or 10. So I last time I checked with one of the companies I wanted to use, I think it was like something like $50 or $60 a month. Okay, and I mean, for my claims, for the services that I use, I'm paid no more than $6 or $7 a month to do everything. And so I know that they're providing a great service, but I kept pleading. I'm like, but you don't understand. I would only be doing six claims a week, sometimes 7, sometimes 8, depending on the caseload. It fluctuates. But I've always wished, I'm like, can't someone even come up with someone's got to be able to come up with because there's a lot of part-time private practice people who would love to have these services, but they just don't want to pay or they can't afford to pay, something that's steep. If you're a full-time private practice and, if you've got 2 clinics that you're running, I totally get it. I mean, because then you're going to be capped at a certain dollar amount and it makes sense that way. But, if you're some guy like me, you need another option.
Yeah. I had to piece it together for a long time as far as using spreadsheet notes. And then most of our clients are Medicaid in our state. So Medicaid provides their own software to use. But then when we had private insurance to bill for a long time, we paper billed those off of a HIC for $1,500.
Oh yeah.
And then, they stopped accepting those. So you had to send it electronically. And I discovered Office Ally, which will allow you to send it for free. I think I actually pay them $20 a month. But still, that's very reasonable. But it's a lot of moving gears there. Just like, if you're using more than one service, then you got to make sure they talk to each other correctly and get sent correctly. Whereas now I'm using Clinic Source now, which is kind of an all-in-one, although you still have to have Office Allies or another clearinghouse to make the transition magic happen to send that on to the insurance. But I've always thought, could you bill me by client? If I have 5 clients, can you prorate that instead of me paying $50, $60 a month? The service is not worth it to me for 5 clients, which, I did on the side work for a long time, worked for someone else on a salary and then did side work, seen just a few clients. But yeah, I couldn't justify spending the $60 a month for just a few clients.
Exactly. And that's the thing is like, I just wish they can prorate it instead of capping it or putting this top end cap and then this bottom cap where they know they're always going to get a certain amount of money no matter what your practice looks like. But yeah, Office Ally, by the way, is something that I've been meaning to look into just for a long time because that's another one that Jessica Aubin on my podcast, she uses Office Ally and I think Availity, maybe it was those 2. So yeah.
What was the other one she uses?
Availity? I think that.
Availity, okay.
Yeah. But yeah, so my thing is, of course, I just want to stay with what I've got for as long as I can. Because it's like one of those things. If it's not broke, don't fix it. Unfortunately, I have an older computer and this PC is about to go on us. So I was joking to my wife. I'm like, as long as we can get the PC just running to the point where we can only use that one program and just have Easy Claim running. I don't care if the rest of it goes, as long as you can do the billing and as long as that, we don't have to switch because it's enough day-to-day business I need to take care of. And if I don't have to learn a new system, then, I'll avoid it as long as I have to.
Oh yeah. When we stepped into using Clinic Source, at that point, I was not doing the billing. For a long time, I did our billing. I brought in, my mother-in-law actually does the billing now. She used to work for Blue Cross. So she has, some knowledge as far as how that works.
Oh, nice.
I think I about gave her an aneurysm when I said, "Hey, we're going to switch, EMRs here and go with this paid one." But
Yeah.
now that she's got it up and running and she's used to it, she said, "Yes, this is easier. The learning curve is sometimes it's always steep when you change systems, but in the long run, it gets easier." So, yeah, I always like to get in the weeds and kind of behind the curtain look of, all right, how are you doing this? And I think other therapists appreciate, hearing how different places do their billing and their progress.
Ultimately, I have to say, my fantasy is there's a practice in my area, nice woman who does not accept, and everything's out of network. And so she basically gives them the Superbill, and they collect whatever they can. Makes her life a lot easier. And it's just something that I wish I can do, but very few of us in this area, it's like, no one wants to pull that trigger because you really risk losing a whole bunch of your clientele.
I did that recently with a client. Well, for a few different insurances, like United is such a pain. And I just refused to take them because, we just lose money. And so I've started offering clients a Superbill. And so I had a client here recently, a parent, and I told her, this is how it works. And she said, "Well, I've never heard of this before." And I was like, "Well, you've never tried to access therapy with United Medical either. I mean, the doctor's fine. He's going to bill it and do okay, but therapy's kind of a different ball game." And she was like, "Well, I just don't know about it." So I had to walk her through it. And so she's in the process of submitting the Superbill. And I tell you, that is such a load off of my shoulders of not having to deal with certain insurance companies and jump through their hoops and wait for their money and give them all their paperwork. It's such a relief.
Well, I'll tell you real quick, TRICARE, I have that one client, I've been with him for just forever. We got to a point where it surprises me sitting here saying this because Medicare is pretty straightforward. So you would figure that TRICARE would be pretty straightforward. But for some reason, we just had years and years of just pain dealing with TRICARE. We got to a point where I asked the mom to bill for me and to handle all the follow-up because it was burning just so much of our resources and time following up with them. Because I remember there was one year, I've been working with this boy now since he was 2003. Okay, so this client's been with my oldest client. All right, he's been with me since he was 2 years of age. And I remember the most horrific year was when TRICARE came and asked me, not just for like recent progress notes, they wanted everything I'd ever done with this kid. So what I did was I found, at the time, it's kind of maybe 5 years ago. So at the time I had a drive, and I was keeping, I think I had to make all these photocopies and scan them and put them in digital form. I mean, this took me forever. I put it all on I had a 6 gig portable drive, like a jump drive, and I put it all in there, and I gave it to mom. I said, here you go. Whatever you need to print out, just print it out. But could you help me out here? Because it was just too insane. And I can't imagine that the folks at TRICARE sat down and actually went through any of this stuff. I look at this as mostly harassment's too strong of a word, but it's just par for the course. It's what they have to do because their main job is to not pay claims if they don't have to. Make our lives a little more difficult. So, I mean, I get it,
we've tried TRICARE over the years, and it's like TRICARE and United in our area. People, just different therapy places won't accept them because they know that it's just a huge headache, and it's, like you said, too many hoops to jump through.
Yeah, United Healthcare has been a major headache for us as well. I'm only credentialed. I'm only in network with Blue Cross. That's it. And so everyone else has got out of network, and we bill as a courtesy to our clients. So except for TRICARE, she submits the Superbill. But I have one now with Cigna, so we bill that. United Healthcare, we've grown, but we'll do it. And then if we need to, we'll ask the family to help us if there's any delay in processing the claim or if there's something major going on. I have to say though, most of my experience is in Blue Cross, so I really can't speak, but at least the Cigna experience so far is better than I expected. I haven't dealt with Cigna in at least probably 5 years, so I don't know.
Good.
It's okay.
I want to switch gears just a little bit. In your private practice now, do you only see a few clients? Do you have to market?
No. This is the weird. It is very odd because just to back up, when I left full-time private practice in 2010, it was a very odd time because I had to let a number of my clients go, and it was very painful because basically what I had to do is I had to sort of, to my early intervention clients, that was a little easier because I was cutting the cord at the time anyway. For the ones who had been with me for a little longer time, I said, you know what, I can only take on so many a week, and some of them were just okay to go. But really what happened was my first year was insane. I was seeing, I must have had about 9 appointments a week. And even to this day, so I work Saturdays. And I remember my first year on the job, I would see maybe Wednesdays, maybe 1 on Friday. And then my Saturdays would just be like, 6 in a row or something like that. And then what happened was over the years, it just kind of, whittled away, but it's always been sort of stable at about, like 5-6 clients. There was a time, there was only the one time, and I was always worried about this as a part-time private practice person, is that it was a very weird time. Last fall, it was like a whole bunch of things just seemed to, I had like 3 clients leave me within a span of like 3 months. Random reasons, not because they were necessarily dissatisfied, but for, I can't remember the individual reasons, but I lost basically half my caseload within a short order. And I was panicking for a time because I rely on the income. I remember saying to my wife, I'm like, and a couple of friends of mine, I'm like, this is exactly this was my biggest fear going back to the school. What happens is that when you're in private practice full time, what happens is you have a larger caseload, and those people refer to their friends, and those people refer to their friends, et cetera. It's like you have like this built-in marketing tool. But when you're going down to like 4 or 5 a week, those circles begin to, close in, and you don't have the people referring out like you did before. And so all it takes is like 2 people to walk away for whatever reasons, and your income flow is just, it can be slashed in a third, overnight. And so that's kind of what happened to me. And here's how it was even more comic. I remember 1 year ago here. So this is August of 2015. 1 year ago today, or not today, around this time, I remember I had like an unprecedented 8 people in 1 month call me and ask me if I had any openings. I told them no, I couldn't take any of them. And so in September, I think one person dropped out. In October, another person. By November, December, one person I think graduated from speech therapy. Another one was, I think 2 of them graduated. I can't remember exactly. But so, at any rate, had to go back and call these people. And of course, they already found other providers. But that's just kind of the precarious, so it's like you're always playing this game where like, maybe I should overbook myself to ensure that I'm going to be busy enough. But then, of course, you overbook yourself. It's like you're spreading yourself too thin. It's like I have this podcast now. I actually have other business interests that I'm trying to get into as well. So, it's not an ideal lifestyle. I'll say that, as far as like having to rely on the income. But, luckily this past spring, I'm back where I need to be. So going forward this fall, I'll be okay. I think I'll have about 6 or 7 appointments a week. So yeah, it worked out.
Yeah, it's hard to find that equilibrium of, all right, I've got the perfect caseload down, the perfect schedule. It's just if you get there, it doesn't last very long.
No, and it's a matter of fact, I have to say, like I would do a whole bunch of things differently if I were in private practice full time again. A lot of things differently, but I think the one mistake that I made was not overbooking myself. It sounds a little weird to say that, but especially with the way insurance has gone and the uncertainty going forward, I just think I think a lot of private practices are just going to have to increase productivity just to ensure some security for themselves going forward. That makes sense. Because again, especially in a smaller practice, all it takes is 1 or 2 people to walk away. And then you say to yourself, well, I had that other person call me last week and I didn't take them on because I capped myself at this number. I think if I had to do it over again, I probably would have raised that cap by probably 3 clients just to give myself a little more wiggle room.
That's a good tip. Everybody listen up and overbook yourself, because you never know when you're going to lose somebody. It's going to happen.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's going to be ebbs and flows in everything, especially a private practice.
There are, yeah.
I want to ask you, how did you get interested in doing a podcast, and tell us about that story?
The podcast. So, I'll repeat a little bit of what I said in my first podcast episode. I'm a kind of a broadcast geek to some extent. When I was an undergrad major, it wasn't in speech pathology. I was a double major. I thought I was going to go to law school, but I had my foot in as a history major and as a communications major, radio, TV, film. And so there's always been that interest in the technology as far as microphones and video. And I remember I did a short documentary when I was in college. And so I've always liked that kind of, the whole broadcasting field and electronic field production. The funny thing is podcasting, depending on who you ask, has been around since the 90s, I suppose, or mid late 90s. I don't know. But to me, podcasting didn't really come online in a big way until, for me, around 2006. Now, that's about the time I remember I got my first little iPod. What do they call it? The iPod. Was it the Nano? Not the Nano. It was that little stick. It didn't have a digital screen. And so, yeah. So I still have mine. It doesn't work, unfortunately. I can use it as storage. It's got 1 gig of space. But I remember back then, you can go on iTunes, and there was a program called, it was NPR's All Songs Considered. And I'm a big music fan. And so it was a way for me to discover new music. And I was working my private practice at the time, and I used to like to go on walks between clients if I had during my lunch hour or whatnot. And I would listen to this podcast. And that's how I really discovered podcasts in a big way, around 2006. And so from there, it's like I started listening to all sorts of short form journalism, long form, politics, economics, you name it. And like when iTunes University came out, like I was even happier. Like now I can listen to this stuff on the go. And for me, like podcasts are just a way of life. When I go to work every day, sometimes I listen to music, but more often than not, it's podcasts. So like I listen to your podcast. I listen to Mark Maron's. I listened to some entrepreneurial ones like Pat Flynn's, the Smart Passive Income podcast. Tim Ferriss, another guy out there whose podcast I like a lot. He interviews like a lot of people, high achievers, and tries to deconstruct and look for advantages that they have or productivity hacks, that kind of thing. So I listen to a lot of these kind of This American Life, and I love it. And so I had this idea since, I would say, at least 2008, where I wanted to do it. But for me, I'm a very shy person, to be quite honest. And I'm not the kind of person, I'm not the first person to pick up the mic and do this, but it's just something that I wanted to see for the longest time. And that it's something that I sort of was gnawing at my, craw, and it's something I just wanted to do forever. And I finally got to the point, 2013, I made up my mind, I'm just going to start doing this. And so I went to YouTube and found this guy, Pat Flynn, whose podcast I now listen to. And he walks you through these like 7 video tutorials, everything from selecting equipment to uploading to iTunes, designing a web page. And I did it all. And lo and behold, I think I recorded my first interview was with Temple Grandin. It was such a, I leave that episode up there as a reminder to myself of how far I've come. Because I look at those first episodes and I'm like, my presentation style, and I've come a long way, I think. But no, I jumped in with both feet, and it was slow to get started, and I finally feel I've developed sort of a rhythm in the whole process as far as approaching people to be guests on the show, doing a good job of listening and interviewing, all those things. So I think it's definitely going to be smoother, and listenership just keeps going up month after month. So that I'm really pleased with.
Well, and I'm a little bit older than you, I think, but I think both of you and I were around and knowledgeable as far as before the internet even existed, or before we had internet.
Yeah.
And then the onset of podcasts. I remember before I started my private practice, I would get in my truck. Before even podcasts existed, I would put my laptop by my seat, and I would have downloaded some audio that I wanted to listen to. And that's how I was listening to stuff back then. I'd run the earphones, and that's before you even had an iPod.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the onset of iPods, and now, you just your iPhone or an Android phone, and the podcast, it's really happened very fast. If you think about the short amount of time, you said 2006 is pretty much when probably iTunes came out. That's, you're talking 10 years ago or less, and probably has really boomed since, 2010 or 12 or so. So, yeah, I really encourage people to get your favorite podcasts and turn off the radio and turn off talk radio. That's just going to depress you anyway.
You can learn. There's so many podcasts out there, and there's so much to choose from. And the thing is, I still think that, at least in the world of speech pathology, there's a lot of people who don't know that podcasts even exist or have a vague idea as to what they are. I don't know if you've come across this, but once in a while, I would say, just as a little FYI, I would say that out of everyone I've ever approached to be a guest on the show, I'd say maybe 1/3 have said yes. So about 2/3 of the people I ask will say no for whatever reason, or not respond. And I'm with that. It was good training and learning how to accept no. And for me, it was invaluable, because the first time I heard no, I was like, "What do you mean you won't be on my podcast?" Now I'm like, "All right, that's cool. We'll find somebody else." But about 1/3 of the people who I approached would say, "Yeah, I'll be on the podcast." And God, I lost my train of thought again. Where was I going with this?
They'll say, "What's a podcast?"
Oh yeah. So here's the thing is, so a number of people actually responded will be like, "So you want me to be on your blog?" They would conflate blog with podcast. So that was like a clue that they didn't really know what they were getting into. They had, I honestly believe that one of at least 2 people have been on the show, when they signed up to do this, didn't really understand what it was that I was doing. They were being recorded, but they didn't really understand how it was going to be presented, because they didn't really understand what a podcast was. So I'm hoping they're cool with it now, but it might always remind me. I always tell the story of my grandmother. She passed away from a brain tumor in 98, but back in 97, I remember she once asked me, she's like, "Are you with the internet?" I'm like, "Come again?" With it. And I remember answering with her, I'm like, "No, I'm with the FBI." That was like, it's like she didn't quite grasp what the internet was, but that was the way that was her way of asking me, "What do you know about this thing called the internet?" And I almost feel like when people say, "Yeah, I'll be on your blog," they don't quite fully understand. They have a vague notion of what it is, but they don't fully understand what it is. So I mean, there's a lot of growth, I think, potential for this.
There is a lot of growth. Yes. And when you see new cars rolling out with the ability to play a podcast right through the car, I mean, there's definitely a future for podcasts. So it's not going anywhere. And it's a great tool to transmit information and just to let people know, okay, this is what Scott sounds like, and this is who Jeff is, and this is his personality and what he sounds like. And just it's so much more intimate than reading a blog post.
It is. Yeah. No, I think especially with Apple and Android getting into the car markets, I mean, I think most models now, I think 2015 and beyond, are going to be equipped to play iTunes and podcasts and everything from your music. So it's not only going to be Bluetooth accessible. It's going to be, and I think that's just you hit it on the head there, that the easier it is for people to access this content, the more willing they'll be to explore and to jump in.
Oh yeah, definitely. I've heard on your podcast before where you'll ask guests if they have any book or website recommendations, and of course you have a very specific niche there of speech therapy. But I would want to ask you, do you have any business books, or I guess it could be speech books too? We have plenty of speech therapists listening. Do you have any business or speech books you're like, you got to have this one and read it?
You know what? I'll give you a recommendation that I might have heard it from either Pat Flynn. I know I've heard it from at least a couple of different podcasts or blog posts. What is it called? The War of Art by Steven Pressfield. Have you heard this book?
I've heard of it, but I've not read it.
It was really, he wrote it addressing artists of all kinds. I mean, he's a writer. He's a guy who wrote, he's probably most known for writing the original book, and I think the adapted screenplay for The Legend of Bagger Vance. Oh. I believe, yeah. So he's probably most famous for that, but he's a novelist, and it's a great inspirational book that basically tells everyone to get off their butt. If there's something you want to do and whatever is holding you back, the excuses that we tell ourselves, the stories that we tell ourselves of why we can't do something. For me, I think that was a big motivation to go forward with the podcast. I don't want to say it was absolutely life-changing, but I think, that book just rings so true in so many ways. I'd recommend everybody, but just to let everyone know, I listened to that in the audio version. So I have an Audible account, and certain narrators are always going to be better than others. And I think a good narrator can make or break an audiobook. the narrator, it's not Stephen Pressfield, I believe, who narrates this book. It's someone else, but he does it in such a, I mean, he just kills it. I think if there's something, professional, personal, and any it's something that's holding you back or something you want to do, listener out there, I think it's just a great inspirational book. I've listened to it multiple times, not always consecutively, but I'll put it on sometimes when I need a little boost. There's just so many great anecdotes in there.
That's
so many great stories.
I have an Audible account too, so I love listening to audiobooks. We're very similar in that regard. So I've got that on my wish list, but I have not purchased it yet. So that might be my next. That might be my next ad.
Yeah, that's the one that's the first one that stands out. I mean, I read business books once in a while. Actually, I've been reading the Steve Jobs biography by Walter Isaacson lately. As far as therapy, business of therapy, unfortunately, aside from your book, the Start a Therapy Practice, I don't think there's too much out there that I have. I remember I purchased this book. I can't remember her name. Oh, this goes back 15 years. Okay, so when I was just first getting the private practice, I was thinking of doing early intervention and then also doing accent reduction therapy on the side. So I took this course. Oh, I hope I'm getting her name right. I think it was Katie Schwartz. Okay, so if I have your name wrong, Katie, my apologies. But this person who spoke about running a private practice with a model on accent reduction and business presentation skills, also had a book, I believe, on sort of like alternate examples of SLPs who had fashioned themselves interesting career niches. And so whether it was a publishing company, materials, that was fairly inspirational. But I remember it's like, here's how my mindset wasn't in the right place. I would read that. I'm like, yeah, but that's not me, or I can't do that. And now I just feel like we live in just a wonderful age where everything is so much easier to gain access. Just the digital age you live in, to start a podcast, to start an online business, to build an app, it's work. It's definitely work, to be sure. But that bar has come so far down where it's like very few of us can come up with that great of an excuse to not do what we want to do.
That's good inspiration. And it brings me to the next question of building an app. I believe you have an app that you're either working on or is just rolling out. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So, so here we are. It's August 2015, and I wish I can tell you the name of the app today. I might have to change it. There's some intellectual property right now that we're sorting through with a company whose work is inspirational to this project. But I'll just kind of describe the app thing, and I'm going to be coming out with an episode that just talks about how I built the app and the process that I went through to do this. And then it's also going to feature someone who's built a very successful app. So just a little promo there. But in that episode, I actually talk about in 2010 when the iPad came out. When I saw this thing, I immediately wanted to build my own app. And it's the same old story that I told myself, I can't do this. I don't have the time, the money, the resources, and all that stuff. And I was going to do it. I remember it was the summer of 2010. I was going to jump in and do it. I told my colleagues I was interested. It's one of those things I didn't do. And part of the reason I didn't do it is because I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know what the first step was. And then what happened was I started compiling a list of all these apps that I would build if I ever had the time, the money, the know-how. And listening to Pat Flynn's podcast, he has an episode with a guy by the name of, and I didn't find this for a while, Mike Doonan. He runs the Speech with Milo apps, or I believe it's called Speech with Milo. And they have a whole set of successful apps. And he talks to Pat about how he built an app. So basically, he essentially gave me a blueprint for how not exactly, because everybody's project's going to be different, right? But he gave me at least a sort of like a rough template of how I could do it if I wanted to. So that was, I probably heard that podcast it was over a year ago. I was going to do it last summer and it slipped by me. And what happened was this year I put my head to it. And I remember January, what I would do is I would get up extra early. I'd go into school where I work at a really early, nobody was there. I get there, sometimes I would get there 6:45. And I would work for sometimes an hour and a half, as many days as I can do, on outlining how I was going to do the app. And I had to slow down because there were times where IEP season came by and I had to just put it aside. But by March and April, I was ready to kind of go out and hire contractors. And so I've used Elance. I don't know how many listeners are familiar with that. It's kind of like it's a website devoted to getting you freelancers. So whether you want to build a website, an app, got some IT concerns, whatever it is you want to do, there's a freelancer for everything, marketing. And then I use 99 Designs, which is a pretty big website. They do logos, illustrations, anything on the artistic side. So I used both those sites to both get the illustrations, the artwork, and then the coder who came from Elance. And my app is it's an app for kids with autism, and it's basically it's sort of like training kids to appreciate eye gaze. So the idea is basically that you'll see, I have a set of 5 characters, and you'll see there's 5 different backgrounds, like a park or a playground, a cafeteria, a classroom, and you'll see the kids in different poses. And the idea is just to say, you'll have a voice prompt. What is Valerie thinking about? And you basically, it's a receptive task only. You touch on the screen that basically what the kids are looking at. And so the idea was to create an app geared more towards early childhood stage, but it could be used for older kids too, as far as teaching that skill, or should I say to help teach a skill, because I make it very clear in the about section of the app that this is really meant to be a layer upon traditional therapy and work on a whole set of other levels with other therapists, parents, professionals, etc. This is one of those things that kids can do for 5-10 minutes on the side. So that's the app. And as a special treat for your listeners, I'd like to offer, for those of you listening, if you work with the population and you work with social skills, and this is important to you, and if you're interested, go ahead and if you go to Scott's page, I want to give away 5 copies of this app too. So cool. Just to get out there, I'll be happy to send some redemption codes. So if you want to put a link up there, I'd be happy to share a few copies. Yeah. So yeah,
I'll put it over there. So yeah, get you a free app there. And the only rule there is with the app is if they get it for free, they have to rate it, right?
Yes, the thing is, I can't say this enough that I really want to make this app as good as it can be. So I'm not going to expect that the first iteration is going to be a bullseye. The thing with the app is that, this is another piece of entrepreneurial advice that I've heard over and over again, is that find whatever it is you're doing, the essential element you have to get right. Everything else, I'm not, so in other words, when I went into this app, and I think I can go on everything I've learned from app development, but you have all these features that you want to put in there, right? Maybe you want to put data tracking, you want to put X option, this option. Then you find out how much it costs or what's actually doable. And you say, and it's sort of like loading up a ship, with cargo, and you can there's only so much room, and you've got to decide what's really important and what's going to have to wait. And I come back, I finish this app, and I said to myself, the essential function of this app, does it meet that objective? Does it do a good job of that? Yes. Does it take data? No. That might come later. It might not. I don't know. But I very much want people to give me as much feedback, honest feedback, constructive feedback, so that I can keep making this app better and better.
I had to listen to that episode with Pat Flynn with Milo, and it was very encouraging. I was like, ooh, I need to make an app. And I haven't done that, but I've researched it over the years, the last couple of years since I heard that. And one of the big upgrades was the data collection to add on to building an app. So I can appreciate why you might not be able to put that in there yet, but it's forthcoming. With all apps, they get added onto and they get polished and made better. Just out of curiosity, I mean, I've done a little bit of research as far as the cost of producing an app, and really it's kind of like you said, you begin to wireframe one out and detail what you want in the app, but none of us are trained to write code to write an app. So you have to farm that out, which is why you went to Elance and 99 Designs. If you wanted something fairly simple in the app game, what's a ballpark figure of producing that, farming that out, and getting that into the app store?
Well, that's a tough question to answer because apps really run the gamut. But I think that the more sophisticated your app is, the more features you put in there, and of course the graphics, animations will kill you. Those are expensive. I coming away from the app that I just built, I want to say that, mine, and I don't mind saying this, my budget was, I probably went about 20% higher than what I originally budgeted. But my app actually cost me in the low 5 figures. And when if for those of you listeners, for those who actually look at my app, and you might say, oh my God, it's prohibitively expensive. There are apps that can be put on if you're just doing a simple articulation app and you just have a bunch of pictures. There's not a lot of animation. It's pretty straightforward, and you didn't build a lot of features. You can certainly probably, especially if you're working with overseas coders, designers, you can reasonably get one out between 4,000 and 6,000. I'm sure, probably on the lower end. But if you look at my app, you'll quickly appreciate why it is that the illustrations cost as much. Actually, we don't have all the smoke hasn't cleared yet, but it actually might wind up being more because the illustration is key. I wanted the pictures to be very rich, very detailed, and I wanted them to be appealing to kids. And so when you look at my app, you're going to be hopefully pleasantly surprised at the level of quality. Not in so much, again, as far in terms of features, it does this great data collection, it exports it to this kind of file, but just that, my goodness, I can tell he went to a lot of trouble to make sure that these characters are really richly drawn and the backgrounds are very rich and that these animations are really nice. There's reward animations. So again, it all comes back down to what are the essential aspects that we can't compromise on? What does this app have to have? What are the elements that have to be just a home run from the get-go? And animations, quality of the pictures, those were number one for me.
Cool. Well, that's a lot of work. Like I said, I've done a little research into it, and that matches the figures that I was looking at as far as the type of app I was wanting to build at the time. I was thinking, that's going to cost, anywhere between $10,000 and $30,000 to build it. And what prohibited me was the money, obviously, but then the time to put into it. So I commend you in putting that much time, and there's a few hoops to jump through in creating an app. So good for you.
Yeah, I have to say that the app thing, it took me, not only did it cost me probably 20 to 30% more bottom line, but the number of hours I put into this thing. And when you look at the app, it's not, again, there aren't that whole lot, that many features in there. There's only a handful of settings, and you really it's that core aspect of having a kid being able to appreciate what someone else is looking at. But you would not even believe the number of hours I've spent on this thing. And I'm not the one coding it, but just going back and conferring with the designer, conferring with the coders, how many different iterations of these things we've gone through. It's not for the faint of heart. There's definitely, there can be rewards at the end of at the end of the process, but it is work. It is work.
Well,
so,
I'm anxious to see it. So definitely head over to the website at startatherapypractice.com. Check out Jeff's app over there, and I'll put a link over there in the show notes.
Yeah,
I've not known anybody who's made an app, so that's exciting.
Yeah, I'll have to, and I'm hoping, and I'll just tell you one little quick story. You want to talk about anxiety inducing? When I was interviewing different coders, I remember I must have talked to this guy. He wanted my business, but we went back and forth at least 3 different Skype calls. He was out of Toronto. He basically told me point blank, he goes, I don't see your app working. I see you spending X amount of dollars, and I see you not even making your money back. And wow. I said, interesting. Why is that? He's like, your market is way too small, which I agree. It is. It's a niche within a niche, because not every kid, my app is not for every kid who happens to have autism. It's for some of them. So it's not for everybody. And so it's a niche within a niche. And his concern was that, there was going to be a finite life cycle for this thing, number one. Number two, he wanted to do a totally different business model where I can create maybe a suite of apps and also maybe perhaps offer in-app purchases. I said, I don't want to do that. I said, I want the people I sell this to be able to buy this once and know that they paid a one-time fee and they'd never have to pay for upgrades, any extra content. And his basic, he said, I'm happy to do this with you. I just don't think you're going to make a dime on this. And so, the analogy that I gave him, I said, here's where I think you're wrong. I said, you're trying to, I think you're trying to compare my app idea to like an Angry Birds, which is, who's Angry Birds for? It's for everybody. A 2-year-old can play Angry Birds, an 80-year-old can play Angry Birds. So even though my app is definitely a niche with a niche. It's not for everybody. It's definitely, but I said, I'm confident that I'll at least make my money back because of what it does and who it can potentially help. And he's trying to tell me, dissuade me by the fact that he said, do you know how many apps there are on the app market today? It's in the millions. So for someone to find your app, it's like a needle in a haystack. I'm like, I don't agree with it. I think it's like people doing keyword searches will find yours, because when you type in social skills autism, you're not going to come up with Angry Birds. And there are a lot of apps out there for that, but it's not an infinite number. I don't even know if it would go past 100. And so I finally came back with this other analogy. I said, you know what? I want to tell you about my podcast for a second, about this podcast I started. I said, there's 500,000 podcasts out on iTunes right now. And I'm happy to say that I didn't realize it. I didn't know this until I'd say maybe March or April this year, that you can find rankings in iTunes for your particular niche. So my podcast, my Conversations in Speech Pathology podcast, is under education training, I think. And so I told him, I said, first time I looked it up, I was shocked to find that I was in the top 300. I said, look, there's 500,000 podcasts out there. I'm in the top 300 in a subcategory. Now, does that mean that I have thousands upon thousands of listeners? No. But does it mean that I have like a critical number that satisfies me and makes me want to put out more episodes? Absolutely. I said, so to tell me that there wouldn't be at least a critical number that would at least guarantee that I can make back the money that I put into it, I just don't see that. I said, you might be right that I'm not going to, I said, I don't expect that. This is not $1 million idea. It was never meant to be that. But I think it can help a lot of kids out there. And I think it will find its own market. So we'll see.
That's what I was thinking, is that if we only want to make the $1 million app, then potentially thousands and maybe tens of thousands of kids who have autism don't get the assistance that they potentially need by Jeff creating this app. So
right.
I'm glad to see you put that out there. And the other thing is that you do have a platform, your podcast, to announce this and to help people know about it. And therapists, especially speech therapists, I've noticed, and OTs also for that matter, are very good about informing their clients and saying, hey, this tool, whether it be an app or a toy or another device, is potentially helpful for your child. You need to check this out. So we're very good at educating our clients about anything that's going to help them. So I have a feeling that the therapist listening here and on your podcast will help you out and get the word out as far as educating their clients about the app. So
so I it's a small, in some ways it's a small world, and people will find it. I think they'll hopefully like it. They'll hopefully recommend it. And I'm proud of what we built. I think it'll find its legs.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Well, Jeff, we need to go, but if somebody wanted to contact you, where would they go? And tell us the website for your podcast.
Sure. Well, the website for the podcast is conversationsinspeech.com. And I actually shortened that. So the podcast itself is Conversations in Speech Pathology, which you can find on the iTunes Store or in Stitcher. And as far as contacting me, probably the best place is jeff@conversationsinspeech.com.
Very good. And I'll put links in the show notes there to the podcast and how to contact you also. But I really appreciate you joining me today, and definitely keep us posted on the app. And I'm excited to see that roll out. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Scott. It's been an honor.
All right. We'll see you later, Jeff. Bye-bye.
All right. Take care.
All right. That was a great interview with Jeff. I found it so interesting, his information about app development. Wouldn't that be cool? If you've developed an app, I'd love for you to email me the information on that app, and then I'll broadcast that out, because I think that would be super cool to know private practice owners who have also developed an app. If I get enough of them, I'll create a page on my website, and everybody can find other private practice owners who have created an app. We could learn from each other. I think that would be so cool. And as we mentioned in the podcast earlier, Jeff is giving away 5 of these apps for free. All you have to do is email him, jeff@conversationsinspeech.com, and let him know that you heard about his app at startatherapypractice.com. Then he's going to choose 5 names, and they will get a free version of that app. Also, subscribe to Jeff's podcast, which is called Conversations in Speech. You can find it in the iTunes Store and in Stitcher, over at his website at conversationsinspeech.com. And you can also listen to his podcasts over at conversationsinspeech.com. That's it for now. I really appreciate you listening. If you have any questions about private practice, be sure to email me, scott@startatherapypractice.com. And until next time, Godspeed to you and to your private practice.